At 71, Kenneth Branagh sits in a small, dimly lit room where the light seems to carry the weight of an entire lifetime. A warm, muted golden glow slips through a half-open window, meeting the gray London sky, an uncertain sky, shifting endlessly between tenderness and coldness. Kenneth leans slightly forward, the posture of a man who has learned over the years that some shadows never truly recede. Then he murmurs, softly, almost as if speaking to the silence itself, "There are 5 people I will never be able to forgive." The words fall heavily, cutting through the quiet like a fine blade pressed against old wood. It is not the confession of a bitter man. It is the admission of someone who has carried wounds long enough for them to become indistinguishable from his own breath. Throughout his illustrious career, Kenneth has embodied characters haunted by betrayal, loss, and fractured loyalty. Yet today, the haunted figure is not a role. It is the man himself. The echoes of his past seem to linger around him, like footsteps refusing to fade in a narrow, darkened hallway. And so the question hangs in the air, trembling, unresolved. Who are these 5 faces he could never erase? And why, even at 71, do their names still weigh so heavily on him? The silence that followed his confession seemed to lead naturally backward into the corridors of his childhood. Those narrow Belfast streets where everything felt both fragile and loud. Kenneth Branagh was born in 1960 in a city divided by fear, where every sound carried an echo of something uncertain. As a boy, he learned early that trust was not freely given. It was something cautiously built, like a house standing in the wind. His family lived modestly, wrapped in the warmth of routine, yet beneath that warmth lay tension, unspoken, constant, pulsing like a faint vibration in the walls. His father worked with calloused hands and a quiet determination. His mother carried her worries like folded letters, tucked closely against her heart. Kenneth watched them both, sensing more than he understood, learning the delicate art of silence long before he ever stepped onto a stage. There was one memory he would later describe as the first fracture, a moment when a promise made to him, simple, innocent, was broken without apology. It was small, almost trivial, yet it carved the earliest line in a map of wounds he would carry for decades. From that day, the boy who loved stories also learned to guard himself from them. He became observant, cautious, always measuring the distance between people's words and their actions. The world taught him, gently at first and then more sharply, that not all kindness was true and not all closeness was safe. By the time he reached adolescence, Kenneth already knew that trust was both a gift and a risk, one he would offer carefully and remember painfully when taken for granted. From the quiet, uncertain streets of his youth, Kenneth Branagh stepped into a world that seemed impossibly vast. London in the late 70s was loud, ambitious, and relentless. For a young man shaped by silence, it was overwhelming, yet strangely magnetic. He studied every voice, every gesture, absorbing them like fragments of a script he was meant to perform. When he auditioned for drama school, it wasn't confidence that carried him, but a quiet hunger, the hope that somewhere in the bright lights, he might find a place where trust was no longer a fragile thing. His rise was swift, too swift, some would later say. Roles came, applause followed, and with each performance, the world leaned closer. Kenneth had a gift. He could inhabit pain without letting it drown him, embody joy without exposing too much of the man beneath. Directors admired him, audiences adored him. Fame, once a distant glow, soon grew into a blinding warmth. But with success came the first hairline cracks, subtle enough to miss if one wasn't looking closely. A colleague he considered a friend took credit for an idea that was his. A promised opportunity dissolved without explanation. Small betrayals, perhaps, but for someone who had spent a lifetime guarding the fragile architecture of trust, they echoed louder than any applause. As his career expanded into directing, the spotlight intensified. Late nights blurred into early mornings. Laughter at rehearsals often masked fatigue he dared not name. Yet he pushed forward, performing with a brilliance that made the industry take notice. Awards arrived, accolades multiplied. He became almost unintentionally a symbol of discipline, eloquence, and depth. And still beneath the glory, A quiet truth persisted. The brighter the lights, the darker the shadows behind him grew. Kenneth began to sense that not everyone who smiled at him wished him well. In the glittering halls of success, loyalty shifted with the wind, and admiration could turn brittle overnight. One evening, after a particularly triumphant premiere, he stood alone in an empty backstage corridor. The applause was still ringing faintly from outside, yet all he felt was a thin thread of unease winding through his chest. Fame had lifted him, yes, but it had also sharpened the edges of every disappointment, every fracture. It was in this ascent, dazzling and treacherous, that the first real betrayals took root, and from here, the descent would begin. Success has a way of testing the seams of a person's life, and for Kenneth Branagh, the first real tear came quietly, without spectacle, without warning. It arrived in the form of someone he once believed would stand beside him through every triumph and uncertainty. A collaborator, a confidant, a voice he trusted. The betrayal was not dramatic, it was subtle, almost surgical. A project they had built together was suddenly presented to the world as if Kenneth's contribution were an afterthought. His name, once central, was pushed to the edge. He remembered the moment he saw the announcement. The room seemed to dim, though the lights had not changed. A numbness spread through him, not from anger at first, but from recognition. A recognition of that old childhood fracture resurfacing, deeper now, sharper now. Trust, once again, had proven fragile. Rumors followed, whispers in hallways, shifting alliances, a few well-placed lies dressed as misunderstandings. The industry that had celebrated him began to feel colder, more mechanical. Kenneth withdrew slightly, not from the work, but from the people around it. The applause still came, but it no longer warmed him. There was another wound too, more personal, quieter, but heavier. A relationship he believed unshakable collapsed under pressures neither of them had foreseen. Words left unspoken became walls. Promises once made in softness dissolved into a silence that hurt more than anger ever could. That year, Kenneth realized something irreversible. Trust is not lost in a single moment, but in the slow accumulation of disappointments. And from those disappointments, 5 names began forming in the shadows. 5 faces he could not erase, no matter how fiercely he tried to move forward. 5 names, 5 wounds. 5 shadows that followed Kenneth Branagh far longer than applause, fame, or recognition ever could. He spoke of them not to assign blame, but to finally acknowledge what had shaped him. Each face, each memory was a turning point, a moment where trust cracked and something in him shifted forever. The first, a gentle wound. The first person he could never forgive was someone from his early years in the industry, a mentor he admired deeply, almost naively. Their bond had been grounded in encouragement, in the sharing of small victories, in quiet doubts. So when that mentor dismissed Kenneth behind closed doors, calling him inexperienced, replaceable, unproven, the words carved deeper than intended, Kenneth never confronted him. He simply carried the sting like a small stone in his pocket, insignificant alone, but unbearably heavy over time. It was the betrayal that taught him caution. The second, unexpected, sharp. The second was a colleague he once considered a genuine friend. Their collaborations had been effortless, marked by laughter and creative instinct. But success changes people. One day, Kenneth discovered that this friend had used his ideas, reshaped them, and presented them publicly as his own. What hurt was not the theft, but the casualness with which it was done, as though Kenneth's trust had never mattered. The shock was sudden, bright, and blinding, like a flash of lightning splitting the sky. It marked the moment he realized talent and loyalty rarely walk hand in hand. The third, the deepest cut. The third person was someone intimately woven into his personal life. A relationship that once felt safe, grounding, necessary. They had built dreams together, naive but sincere. But distance grew, slowly at first, then all at once. Promises weakened, words sharpened, and eventually the foundation cracked. What hurt most was not the separation, but the revelation that love alone could not guarantee honesty. that even the most cherished hearts can falter. This betrayal reshaped him profoundly. It taught him that vulnerability carries a price, and the people closest to us can wound us more than any stranger ever could. The fourth, the public fracture. The fourth person, or rather the fourth force, was the industry itself. Not a single individual, but a collective of voices that once lifted him and later questioned his worth. Critics who turned cold, colleagues who distanced themselves when rumors surfaced, studios that withdrew support at the first sign of difficulty. The betrayal here was public, loud, and indifferent. It wasn't personal, yet it felt deeply personal. Kenneth realized that fame is a fragile currency. Loyalty within the spotlight is conditional. The applause that once embraced him now echoed with hollowness. This was the betrayal that taught him resilience, but also isolation. The fifth, the unavoidable truth. And then there was the fifth, the one he avoided naming for years, the one whose shadow lingered every time he looked in the mirror. Himself. Kenneth Branagh confessed that he could never quite forgive the younger version of himself. The man who stayed silent when he should have spoken, who trusted too easily, who gave too much, who carried guilt that was never his to bear. He blamed himself for believing in people who were never meant to stay, for holding on to memories long after they turned to dust, for returning to wounds he should have allowed to heal. But beneath that confession was something more fragile: regret, not for what he had done, but for what he had endured. He wished he had protected himself sooner. He wished he had learned to walk away earlier. He wished forgiveness came easier. As he spoke of these five figures, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Yet in his voice, there was no bitterness, only clarity. These five names were not chains, they were chapters. And by naming them at last, he was finally closing the book. The room grew still again as Kenneth Branagh finished speaking, as if the air itself needed a moment to understand the weight of what had just been revealed. Outside, the late afternoon light had softened into a muted gold, casting gentle shadows across the floor. Shadows that no longer seemed to threaten, but to accompany him quietly, like old companions that had finally stopped demanding attention. Kenneth sat back, exhaling slowly, his shoulders easing for the first time since the conversation began. In naming the five people he could never forgive, mentor, friend, lover, industry, and finally himself, he had not purged the past, but illuminated it. The wounds were still there, but their edges no longer cut as deeply. They belonged to a life fully lived, a life shaped by trust given, lost, and painfully reclaimed. On the table beside him lay a small notebook, worn at the spine, filled with years of fragments, lines of dialogue, unfinished thoughts, moments he had tried to preserve before they slipped away. He touched it gently as though acknowledging every version of himself that had carried him to this moment. And then, in a tone barely above a whisper, he offered the simplest truth of all. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's learning to live without the weight. But can anyone truly live free of the wounds they carry? Or must some memories remain so we never forget the depth of what we once felt?